Hello and welcome to another episode of Ewell Acres. Today, as we continue talking about gardening plants, we're going to be talking about the difference between annuals, biennials, perennials, what they mean, and the advantages and disadvantages. Let's get started. Now, if you like what we're doing, if you're gaining value out of these videos, please don't forget to subscribe, click on that bell for notifications, give us a thumbs up, because not only will that help us out with YouTube algorithms, that will allow us to help to better spread these videos around so people can gain education and value out of them. So that way we can not only learn from each other, but with each other. Now, when you're looking at plants and trying to decide what you want to grow with annuals, biennials, or perennials, a lot of times people can get confused what that means. What that term means all has to deal with what the life cycle of the plant is. Simply broken down, annuals are going to live their entire life cycle in just one season, meaning that they are going to germinate from seed, live, flower, form their produce, form seed, and die, meaning the roots, stem, and foliage all die in one season. Biennials are going to live for a max of 2 seasons, meaning they're going to germinate from seed or propagate, however they are, form a small rosette, and then go into dormancy that first winter season. The next year, they're going to form much larger stems, they're going to flower, develop seed, and die, meaning their roots, stem, and foliage completely die by that second season. Perennials are going to live for 3 seasons or more, meaning that they're going to germinate, start to form plants, and then they're going to continue to flower, produce seed year after year after year. The roots, the stem, and the foliage themselves are not going to die at that point in time. They're oftentimes going to go into a period of dormancy during the cold weather or when conditions are not as favorable, and they will live for many years on, oftentimes longer term. Now, the term of that life cycle can vary from plant to plant. Oftentimes, strawberries are going to live in that 3 to 5 year period of time, whereas you have your apple trees, your nut trees, much larger perennials, can live for decades upon decades. So the size of the plant will vary from species to species. Now, when you're looking at these different life cycles and how the plant has historically chosen to live, what will determine that is typically where that plant is from. Typically, annuals and biennials are going to be from a colder climate, and they've just decided to, genetically speaking, not have to fight those, but produce seed, and so the next generation will go the next year. That is how they have decided to form. Perennials, they chose the evolutionary strategy to grow bigger, stronger, so they can more handle those more distressed conditions, whether that be drought, whether that be winter, whatever that native climate's from. Typically speaking, perennials, as by and large, tend to come from tropical regions. On a whole, there's going to be much more perennial plants living in a tropical climate than you will find annuals or perennials. Likewise, typically speaking, as a whole, species-wise, you're going to find a lot more annuals and biennials in cold climates than you will perennials. Now, in looking at some of the advantages and disadvantages of these different life cycles, annuals have some really great advantages. They are going to grow produce food and die on that same season, which means they're going to have a very short growing season. They're going to be short, compact, can grow up, and move on. So when you're going to gain produce or harvest them is going to be a much shorter period of time than when you're dealing with perennials or biennials on some occasions. Also, another great advantage of annuals is, financially speaking, they are going to be a much smaller investment. Because they're producing a lot more seed, they are going to be able to be much cheaper. On the same side, space-wise, when you're dealing with them, annuals typically are going to take up a much smaller area of space. So if you want to grow in a container or you have a very limited growing space, annuals are probably going to be your preferred choice when you're dealing with it. Now, in looking at annuals, there are some downsides to them as well. Yes, the upfront financial costs of annuals are going to be much cheaper, but because of that, you're going to have to spend a lot more money in the long term if you want to purchase your seed. Now, in some cases, it makes it much easier to make your own seed, but if you don't and you're purchasing it long term, there's going to be a much larger financial cost. Also, when you're dealing with annuals, they tend to be a little bit more susceptible to insects, to diseases, because they're going to be smaller. They don't have that nutrient reserve to be able to combat them. And so when they get an insect infestation, when they get a disease infestation, typically speaking, they're not going to be as resilient as your bigger perennial plants, and it's often going to kill them. But on the flip side, because of that, they may be small. It's very easy financially to replace them. Space-wise, they're very friendly. Another major disadvantage of annuals, as we talked a little bit before, they tend to be from colder climatic conditions. As soon as it gets cold, they are going to die. Now, there are some annuals that are going to be more cold resistant. Your peas become by far the most popular garden vegetable that fits into that category. But they also have a downside. They're not going to be as heat tolerant. They tend to do really well in one and not so well with the other. So your peas do really well in cold, not so great in the heat. But you have some other plants that can work with it that do much better in the heat, like your tomatoes, but they don't do so well in the cold. Now, when you're looking at annuals per time investment, another major disadvantage is because they are smaller, they do take a little bit more time. They have a much smaller root structure, they have a much smaller head space, and so they only have so much area in which they can draw up nutrients. They only have so much area that they can draw up water. So you're going to have to water them a lot more. You're going to have to weed them a lot more in taking care of them because they're going to be a little bit more susceptible to those outside. They're going to be much more susceptible to those outside influences, and so you may have to baby them a little bit more for a much smaller amount of produce. In comparing a head of lettuce to an apple tree, yes, you may have to have similar time constraints in trying to take care of them when it talks about planting, harvesting, watering, weeding, all that it takes. You're going to get a much larger group of harvest in comparison to the two different plants. So that is one thing to keep in mind. It takes a very large time investment for much smaller produce that you're going to get out of it. When you're looking at the advantages and disadvantages of biennials, they are going to be almost exactly the same as annuals, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on that because oftentimes they are going to be from the very same climates as annuals. The one major difference that you're going to... So when you're dealing with biennials, typically speaking, they're going to be cheaper. They're going to be able to produce more for the advantages. There's going to be a very small financial cost when it comes to it. But with the disadvantages, it's going to be a very reoccurring cost that you have to deal with. One major difference, though, when you're comparing the advantages and disadvantages of biennials is oftentimes you can trick biennials into producing seed that very same year. So a great example of this is going to be carrots and onions. Oftentimes you can trick carrots and onions into producing seed that very first year rather than having to wait to the second year. And this is going to be exposed when you're dealing with either very extreme heat or dealing with some cold snaps. And it's going to tell the plant, hey, it's getting towards the end of the season, hurry up and start producing seed so that way you can continue on your generations. However, this will affect the plants. This is through a process called bolting. When you have carrots bolt, they're going to shoot up their seed heads. When you have onions bolt, they're going to shoot up their seed heads. And if you let it go to seed, oftentimes it's going to make the produce bitter, unedible, or in the case of carrots, it's going to make them very woody and not the desired traits that you want for a nice, soft, sweet carrot. Because those traits are very similar to each other, we're going to go ahead and move on to perennials. There are some great advantages to perennials. They are going to be much larger. They are going to be, in the long run, very cost effective. Annuals, biennials, they have very short life cycles, so you have to purchase them again and again, or you have to do things what you need to get seed year after year. Oftentimes, perennials, they are going to have a much longer lifespan. Because of that, you purchase your plants once and they will live long term. Strawberries, you can have them produce fruit for 5 to 6 years. Whereas when you're dealing with apple trees, they can produce for decades. And so cost effective in the long term, it's going to be very large. Oftentimes, your perennials are going to be much larger. They're going to have a larger root system. They are going to have a much larger canopy, meaning they're going to be able to reach down deeper. They're going to be able to get more water deeper than the annuals can get. They're going to be able to get nutrients much deeper and draw those to the surface, so not only they can benefit the annuals and biennials, but they're going to be much more self-sufficient. You do not have to spend as much time concerned about watering. You're not going to have to spend as much time concerned about the weeding, because oftentimes they're going to be able to outcompete those smaller plants. Now, with the same advantage, because they're going to be bigger, though they may be sometimes susceptible to similar insects, to similar diseases as the annuals and biennials, because they're much larger, they are going to be able to more easily combat and overcome those pressures in trying to feed off of them. A large apple tree is much more easily going to be able to fight off an attack of aphids than a head of lettuce will. It's going to take much more to affect that plant because it has a much larger defense mechanism. Now, those are some of the great advantages. One of the most wonderful advantages that I love, I already mentioned it before, but perennials just give year after year after year. Once the apple tree gets going, once it starts producing fruit, you are going to get bushels and bushels. You're going to have so much produce coming out of your ears. Unless you're a commercial seller like me and trying to sell the produce, you're going to have way more than your own family. You're going to be able to start giving it to your family. You're going to be able to give it to your friends, your neighbors. You're going to become very popular in your community. That is one of the reasons why for market gardeners, for homesteaders, it is almost highly encouraged and sought after to have a small orchard, because that is going to be a tremendous source of food for the long-term haul. Now, even though there are really great advantages to perennials, they also have some disadvantages. We already talked about how large and great these perennials are because they can overcome a very large area. Well, one of the disadvantages, they are very space intensive. It's not like you can just take a whole apple tree, stick it in a container, and put it on your counter like you could some small basil or other herbs. If you are very limited on space, then perennials might not be your thing. They are going to be a very long-term investment, and you have to look 5, 10, 20 years plus down the road. When you're looking at planting perennials, you don't want to look just what the plant looks like right now. How large is that plant going to get? Another major disadvantages that you have with perennial plants is if you have disease pressures, if you have insect pressures on annuals or biennials, you can employ a farming tactic called crop rotation. Let's say you're dealing with tomatoes, peppers. One major disease that affects them is a disease called tomato spotted wilt virus. If it attacks them, simply next season, plant them in a different location and you can help to break that cycle up so they're not going to get attacked year after year. You do not have that possibility with perennials. If your tree gets a disease, it has it for life. By far, one of the most devastating diseases that fruit trees can get is fire blight. And unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you can do with fire blight. There are some things that you can help to mitigate the disease, to help keep it from spreading. But once that disease takes hold, your tree is gone. And the best you can do is start chopping out branches, start cutting out areas that is the infected area, and hopefully it does not affect the rest of the tree. When your tree gets attacked by a disease and insects, once it really starts to take hold, unfortunately, the only option you have, depending on the disease or insect, is that plant dies. And unlike an annual or biennial, when the plant dies, okay, plant again next season. Time-wise, financially, space, you don't have a large investment dealing with that plant. With perennials, you may have 20, 30 years invested in that nut tree, that fruit tree. When it dies from an insect or a disease, it is very devastating because you just lost a couple decades worth of potential growth that has happened there. One other major downside when you're dealing with perennials is we already talked about the long-term financial benefit of them. They are going to be very cost-effective long-term. When you're dealing with perennials, though, they are going to be very expensive in the upfront costs. If you want a really nice apple tree in spring 2021, you're looking at $50, $60 plus, depending on the availability and your location. It's going to be much more expensive to get one apple tree than it will in getting hundreds, if not millions, of heads of lettuce for that exact same cost. So you have to weigh out the financial cost, the space induciveness, and decide what you want to get. Oftentimes, though, with most people, you're going to employ all three because all three are going to grow different things. With having said that, and along those same lines, one thing that I would encourage you is for you to gain more success in your growing plants, understand the history, the genealogy, the genetics, the historical climatic conditions of where that plant evolved. By understanding where the native plants evolved, what conditions they need, the water, the nutrients, by understanding that information, you will be much more successful in growing that plant because you'll understand its needs. A cactus has much greater differences in their growth requirements needed than, say, corn, which has much higher nitrogen needs. So by understanding where that plant comes from, it will make you much more successful in growing that particular plant, whatever you decide to grow. Thank you so much for joining us today as we take a quick look at the differences between annuals, biennials, and perennials. Thank you so much for joining us. Remember, don't forget, if you're gaining value out of these videos, don't forget to subscribe, click on that bell for notifications, and give us a thumbs up if you liked us. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.